The smell hit me first. Crude oil mixed with something else, something wrong. Something that made my stomach turn the way roadkill does when it's been baking under the Texas sun for too long. But here's the thing, we were 300 miles offshore in the Gulf of Mexico, on Rig 47. There shouldn't have been any smell like that out here. Just salt, diesel, and the constant metallic tang of the platform itself. My name's Jake Morrison, and I've worked oil rigs for 15 years. Started when I was 22, fresh out of Corpus Christi with nothing but a high school diploma and bills to pay. The money was good, real good, 2 weeks on, 2 weeks off, 28 days a year of actual work for 6 figures. But after what happened during my last rotation, I'm never going back. And before you click away thinking this is just another scary story, I've got the recordings. The company tried to bury them, but I kept copies. You'll hear them at the end. You'll understand why I can't sleep anymore, why I moved inland, as far from the coast as I could get. Why I check my water faucets 3 times before I drink anything. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me tell you what really happened on Rig 47, and why they shut it down. The story is about to begin. It was a Tuesday when I got the call, October 3rd to be exact. I was sitting in my apartment in Houston, watching the Astros lose another game when my phone buzzed. The caller ID showed my supervisor, Big Mike. That's what everyone called him, 6'4", 300 pounds of Louisiana muscle and meanness, but he took care of his crew. "Jake, you sitting down?" His voice sounded different, strained. "Yeah, Mike, what's up?" There was a pause, long enough that I checked to make sure the call hadn't dropped. "I need you on 47 tomorrow morning, emergency rotation." My beer stopped halfway to my mouth. "Tomorrow." "Mike, I just got off 2 days ago. I'm not scheduled for another 12 days. "I know." Another pause. "Triple overtime, Jake, the whole 2 weeks, plus hazard pay." Now that got my attention. Triple overtime plus hazard was serious money. We're talking about turning a 20 grand rotation into 60, but it also meant something was seriously wrong. What happened to the regular crew? Mike cleared his throat, they had to be evacuated. Medical situation. All of them? Most of them. "Listen, Jake, I need guys I can trust out there. Guys who won't ask too many questions and can keep their mouths shut. The company's sending some specialists to figure out what's going on, but we need to keep pumping. You know how it is." I did know. Every day a rig isn't pumping, the company loses millions. They'd keep that platform running through a hurricane if they could. Hell, sometimes they did. Who else is going? Tommy Briggs, Carlos Mendoza, and, he hesitated, Danny Chen. I hadn't heard that name in 5 years. We'd worked together on Rig 32 before he'd transferred to management. Smart guy, MIT graduate who decided he'd rather work with his hands than sit behind a desk. But there were rumors about why he really left 32. Stories about him spending too much time staring at the monitors, talking about patterns in the data that nobody else could see. Danny's coming out of retirement for this? The company specifically requested him, something about his expertise with deep water drilling anomalies. That was a new one. "Mike, level with me. What are we walking into?" I heard him shift in his chair, that old leather creak I remembered from his office. "Honestly, Jake, I don't know. The crew that got evacuated, they're not talking, the ones that can talk anyway. 3 of them are in psychiatric hold at Houston Methodist." "Psychiatric hold? That's all I know. You in or out? I need an answer now. Helicopter leaves at 0600. I looked around my empty apartment, at the stack of bills on my kitchen counter, at the photo of my ex-wife who'd left because I was gone half the year. 60 grand for 2 weeks of work. Whatever was happening on 47, how bad could it be? I'm in. Good man. Pack light and bring your own water. Don't drink anything from the rig's desalination system. Why? But he'd already hung up. That night I barely slept, kept thinking about what could put 3 roughnecks in psychiatric hold. These weren't soft men. These were guys who'd lost fingers without crying, who'd worked through broken ribs, who'd seen people crushed by equipment and kept going. What could break men like that? The helicopter ride the next morning was silent. Tommy and Carlos nodded when I climbed in, but nobody talked. Danny sat in the corner reading something on his tablet, occasionally making notes. He looked older, thinner. His hair had gone completely gray. As we approached 47, I pressed my face to the window. The rig looked normal from a distance, the same massive steel platform rising from the water like a metal island. The derrick stretched into the sky, the flare stack burning off excess gas in a constant flame. But as we got closer, I noticed something odd. No birds. Usually, rigs attracted seabirds. They'd rest on the railings, nest in the structure. But 47 was bare, not a single bird in sight. The helicopter touched down and we grabbed our bags. The landing crew looked relieved to see us, too relieved, like drowning men seeing a life preserver. But there was something else in their eyes, too, fear. "Thank God you're here," one of them said. A kid, couldn't have been more than 25. "We've been running skeleton crew for 3 days. "Where is everyone?" Tommy asked. The kid's eyes darted toward the derrick. "Some left on the evacuation choppers. Others," he swallowed hard, "others are in the medical bay. Doc says don't go near them." "Why?" I asked. But the kid was already walking away, fast like he'd said too much. We found our bunks and stowed our gear. The rig felt wrong, too quiet. A drilling platform is never quiet. There's always the hum of machinery, the clang of metal, the shouts of workers. But 47 felt muffled, like someone had thrown a heavy blanket over everything. That first night I was assigned to the midnight shift. The devil's hour, we called it, 3 to 4 a.m., when accidents happened, when people made mistakes, when things went wrong. Tommy was my shift partner. We suited up in our coveralls and hard hats, grabbed our radios, and headed to the drill floor. The derrick loomed above us, lit by harsh LED floods that turned everything stark white in deep shadow. "You feel that?" Tommy asked. I did. A vibration in the deck plates, rhythmic, like a heartbeat. But that wasn't unusual. The drill string was over 2 miles long, spinning constantly, boring through rock and sediment. It always caused vibrations. "It's probably nothing," I said. But as we checked the equipment, I noticed the drill readouts. We were at 18,000 feet. Deeper than I'd ever seen on a Gulf rig. The pressure readings were off the charts. "Jesus?" Tommy whistled. "What are they drilling for, the center of the earth?" I was about to respond when the radio crackled. All hands. Stay clear of pump station 3. Repeat. Stay clear of pump station 3. Tommy and I exchanged glances. Pump station 3 was directly below us, 1 level down. "What's wrong with 3? Tommy called into his radio. No response. We continued our rounds, checking gauges, logging readings. Everything seemed normal except for that depth and pressure. Then, at exactly 3:33 a.m., the vibration changed. It became irregular, like the heartbeat had developed an arrhythmia. "Jake," Tommy grabbed my arm. "Look at this." He was pointing at one of the mud tanks, the massive containers that held the drilling mud we pumped down to lubricate the drill bit and carry rock cuttings back to the surface. The mud was moving. Not sloshing from the platform's motion, but writhing, like something was swimming in it. I leaned closer. The mud was thick, gray, brown, opaque, but just under the surface I could swear I saw shapes, shadows that moved against the current, that seemed to have purpose. "Tell that too." The lights went out. Complete darkness on an oil rig is a special kind of terror. It's not just dark, it's an aggressive absence of light, like the night is trying to swallow you whole. For 3 seconds we stood frozen. Then the emergency generators kicked in, bathing everything in red. In that crimson light, the mud tank looked like a pool of blood, and the shapes underneath, they were more visible now. Long, sinuous things that pressed against the surface tension without breaking through. "We need to report this," Tommy said, his voice tight. I grabbed the radio. "Control, this is Jake Morrison on the drill floor. We've got something in mud tank 2. Static." "Control, do you copy?" More static than a voice I didn't recognize. Calm, clinical. "Mr. Morrison, please evacuate the drill floor immediately." "Who is this?" "Dr. Elizabeth Warner, Blackwater Energy Special Projects Division. Please evacuate now." "Special Projects Division. I'd never heard of it." Tommy was backing away from the tank. "Jake, it's climbing." I turned. The mud was mounding up in the center of the tank, rising like a slow-motion geyser. But it wasn't spraying. It was holding its shape, forming something almost like a column. Then the column began to branch, spreading into what looked like, "Run," I said. We ran. Behind us, I heard a sound I'll never forget, a wet slapping like 1,000 fish hitting a deck at once. But underneath that, voices. Whispers in a language that wasn't quite words but made my teeth ache. We burst through the door into the interior corridors, slamming it behind us. Tommy was pale, sweating. "What the hell was that?" Before I could answer, Danny Chen rounded the corner. He looked excited, almost manic. "You saw it, didn't you? The manifestation." "Danny, what are you talking about?" He grabbed my shoulders. "We hit something at 15,000 feet, a pocket." But it wasn't gas or oil. The drill telemetry showed impossible readings, negative pressure that should have created a vacuum but didn't. Temperature spikes that should have melted the drill bit but didn't. And the samples, his eyes were wild. The samples were alive. "Alive?" Tommy laughed, but it was a nervous sound. "Danny, oil is just dead plants and animals from millions of years ago." "No!" Danny shook his head. "Not was alive, is alive. The molecular structure, it responds to stimuli, it reproduces, it thinks. Oil doesn't think," I said. "This isn't oil." Danny pulled out his tablet, showed us a microscope image. It looked like neural pathways, branching and connecting, pulsing with bioluminescence. "This is something else, something that's been down there, sealed away for God knows how long, and we punctured its containment." The lights flickered. In the distance, an alarm began to wail. Gentlemen, Dr. Warner's voice echoed through the corridor PA system. Please report to the briefing room immediately. We had no choice but to go. The briefing room was packed. The skeleton crew, maybe 15 of us total, sat in folding chairs while Dr. Warner stood at the front. She was younger than I expected, maybe 35, with the kind of sharp, predatory intelligence you see in corporate lawyers. "I'll be direct," she began. Rig 47 has encountered what we classify as a Type 3 subsurface anomaly. Our models suggest... Your models? Big Tom from the morning crew stood up. He'd been on rigs for 30 years. "Lady, there's something in the mud tanks that ain't mud, half the crew's in the medical bay speaking in tongues, and you want to talk about models?" Dr. Warner's expression didn't change. "The entity you've observed is a form of extremophile organism, likely silicon-based rather than carbon-based. It's been dormant in a geological pocket roughly 3 miles below the seafloor. The drilling operation has allowed it to migrate up through the drill string." "Entity?" Carlos spoke for the first time since we'd arrived. "You're saying this thing is alive, in a sense?" "It exhibits behaviors consistent with a colony organism, similar to a slime mold, but with significantly more complex neural activity. It appears to be able to interface with human consciousness through mechanisms we don't fully understand." "Interface?" I stood up. "Doc, 3 of our guys are in psychiatric hold. What did this thing do to them?" For the first time, Dr. Warner looked uncomfortable. "The organism seems to communicate through the transmission of complex molecular patterns. These patterns can affect human brain chemistry, causing hallucinations, altered states of consciousness, and in some cases," she paused, "shared experiences that transcend individual perception." "You're saying it's telepathic," Danny said. It wasn't a question. "We prefer the term consciousness interfacing, but essentially, yes." The room erupted. People shouting, cursing, demanding to be evacuated immediately. Dr. Warner raised her hand for silence. "Evacuation is not an option. This rig is now under quarantine by order of the Department of Energy and the CDC. We cannot risk contamination reaching the mainland." "You can't keep us here," someone shouted. "I can and I will." However, she pulled up a presentation on the screen behind her. "If you cooperate and help us contain and study this organism, Blackwater Energy is prepared to offer each of you a compensation package of $500,000, tax-free, plus lifetime medical coverage for any side effects." The room went quiet. That was retirement money. That was never work again money. "What do you need us to do?" Big Tom asked. "Continue normal operations as much as possible. Monitor the organism's behavior. Report any unusual experiences immediately. And above all," she looked directly at each of us, "do not attempt to communicate with it directly." But it was already too late for that warning. Because that night, during my second shift, I heard my daughter's voice calling from Mud Tank 2. My daughter who died in a car accident 3 years ago. "Daddy, Daddy, I'm cold." I stood at the edge of the mud tank, my flashlight beam playing across the surface. The substance had changed. It wasn't gray-brown anymore, but black with an oil-slick sheen that showed colors that shouldn't exist. "It's not her," I told myself. "Sophie's gone. This is just that thing playing tricks." But the voice, God, it was perfect. Every inflection, every little catch in her words when she was scared. "Daddy, please, it's dark here. I can't find my way out." My hand was on the ladder that led down to the tank's maintenance platform. 1 step, 2 steps. The metal was warm under my palms, pulsing with that heartbeat rhythm. "Jake!" Tommy's shout broke whatever spell I was under. I jerked back, nearly falling. "Jesus, man, what are you doing?" I looked down. I was halfway over the rim of the tank, one leg already swinging over. I had no memory of climbing that far. I heard... Yeah, I know what you heard. It's been calling to everyone. Different voices for different people. Carlos heard his mother. Big Tom heard his dead wife. It knows things, Jake. Things it shouldn't know. We backed away from the tank. In the distance, I could see other crew members standing near various pieces of equipment, all staring at nothing, all listening to something only they could hear. "We need to find Danny," I said. "We found him in the lab, surrounded by monitors and microscopes." He hadn't slept. You could see it in the dark circles under his eyes, the tremor in his hands. But his excitement was undimmed. "It's learning," he said without preamble. "Look at this." On his screen was a time-lapse video of a sample in a petri dish. The black substance formed patterns, geometric at first, then more complex. Spirals became fractals, became something that hurt to look at directly. It's responding to electrical signals from the equipment. But more than that, he pulled up another screen. A complex one. I've run it through every database I have. Know what the closest match is. We shook our heads. Human brainwaves during REM sleep. It's dreaming, Jake. This thing is dreaming, and somehow it's pulling us into its dreams. That's insane, Tommy said. Is it? Every culture has myths about things sleeping beneath the earth. Lovecraft wrote about dead Cthulhu dreaming in R'lyeh. The Gnostics believed the material world was the dream of a blind, idiot god. What if they were picking up on something real? Something that's been down there all along? Before I could respond, the lights flickered again. But this time, they didn't come back on fully. Instead, they dimmed to a deep amber that made everything look like it was underwater. Dr. Warner's voice crackled over the PA. All personnel, remain calm. We are experiencing some electrical interference. Backup systems are, her voice cut out, replaced by something else, a sound like whale song slowed down 1,000 times, so deep it was more felt than heard. The monitors in the lab began to flicker, showing images that didn't come from any camera. I saw the seafloor, but not as it should be. It was covered in structures that looked organic and geometric at once, like coral reefs designed by some alien mathematician. Things moved between them, long, serpentine shapes with too many joints, all flowing in the same direction. Toward us. It's not just in the tanks anymore, Danny whispered. It's in the pipes. The entire drill string is contaminated. Every system that uses water or oil, it's spreading through all of it. As if to confirm his words, black fluid began seeping from the ventilation grates. Not pouring, but reaching, extending tendrils that felt their way along the walls like blind fingers. Evacuation protocol, someone screamed over the radio. All hands to the helicopter pad. But when we ran outside, we saw why that wasn't going to work. The sea around Rig 47 had turned black, not oil spill black, but the deep black of space, of the gaps between stars. And it was rising, not in waves, but in columns, pillars of dark water that reached toward the platform like grasping hands. The helicopter that had been prepped for emergency evacuation tried to take off. It made it maybe 50 feet before a column of black water engulfed it. The aircraft didn't crash, it just stopped existing. One moment it was there, the next, only empty air and falling drops of that impossible black rain. "Inside!" Dr. Warner appeared in a hazmat suit, gesturing frantically. "Sealed areas only." We ran for the emergency shelter, a reinforced compartment designed to withstand hurricanes and explosions. As we crowded inside, I did a quick head count. 9 of us, that was all. The others were either missing or, through the porthole, I saw Carlos standing on the helipad. He was removing his clothes, methodically, peacefully. His skin had dark veins spreading across it like a road map. When he was naked, he walked to the edge of the platform and stepped off. He didn't fall. The black water rose to meet him, embracing him like a lover, and he sank into it slowly, smiling. "God help us," Big Tom whispered, but I wasn't sure God could hear us anymore. Because outside, the thing from beneath the earth was singing, and its song was rewriting the rules of reality. Danny was working furiously on his tablet, equations streaming across the screen. "I think I understand," he muttered. "It's not from here, not from Earth. It's been trapped, maybe since the planet formed. And we just gave it a way out. How do we stop it?" Dr. Warner demanded. Danny laughed. "It wasn't a sane sound. Stop it? Doctor, we can't stop it. It's been waiting billions of years. It's older than multicellular life. We're nothing to it, less than bacteria. But," he paused, his fingers flying over the keyboard, "we might be able to put it back to sleep." "How?" The drill string. "If we reverse the pressure, create a massive implosion at the source point, we might be able to seal the breach. But someone would have to go to the drill floor, manually override the safeties. That's suicide," Tommy said. "You saw what happened to Carlos. Not if they're protected." Dr. Warner pulled out a metal briefcase. Inside were syringes filled with a silver fluid, experimental neural inhibitor. "It should block the organism's consciousness. Interfacing ability. Should." "Should?" I stared at her. "You had this the whole time. We've encountered type 3 anomalies before, smaller ones. This is unprecedented in scale, but the principle should be the same. The inhibitor will give someone approximately 20 minutes of protection, more than enough time to reach the drill floor and trigger the implosion." We all looked at each other. Nobody volunteered. Then I heard Sophie's voice again, clearer than ever. But this time I understood what it really was. Not my daughter, but an echo of her pulled from my memories. This thing, whatever it was, fed on consciousness, on memories and dreams and the electric patterns of thought. And if it escaped, if it reached the mainland, I'll do it, I said. The injection felt like ice water in my veins. Dr. Warner said that was normal, that the neural inhibitor was designed to create a chemical firewall between my consciousness and external influences. but as the silver fluid spread through my system, I felt something else, a distancing from myself, like I was watching my body from the outside. 20 minutes, Dr. Warner repeated, checking her watch. Starting now. I put on the hazmat suit, though we all knew it was more for psychological comfort than actual protection. Through the shelter's airlock, I could see the corridor beyond. The black substance had spread across the walls like veins, pulsing with bioluminescent patterns that spelled out words and languages that had never existed. "Jake," Tommy grabbed my arm. "If you don't make it, tell my ex-wife I was thinking about her at the end," I said. "Tell her I'm sorry I wasn't there more." He nodded. I cycled through the airlock. The moment I stepped outside, I understood the true scope of what we were facing. The organism hadn't just contaminated the rig, it had transformed it. The metal walls breathed like skin. The pipes had become arteries carrying black blood. And everywhere there were eyes. Not human eyes, but patches of awareness that tracked my movement, that saw through more dimensions than 3. The inhibitor was working, though. While I could perceive these changes, they couldn't touch my mind. The whispers that filled the air, my daughter's voice, my parents, every person I'd ever loved or lost, slid off my consciousness like rain off glass. I had to reach the drill floor, 2 levels up, then across the platform. Simple. Except the ladder had become something else. The rungs were soft, warm, covered in what felt like skin. As I climbed, I could feel a pulse through them, synchronized with my heartbeat. No, not synchronized, controlling. My heart was matching its rhythm, not the other way around. 15 minutes. I forced myself to climb faster. On the next level, I saw what had happened to the missing crew members. They stood in a circle around one of the auxiliary pumps, their bodies connected by strands of the black substance. Their eyes were open but showed no whites, no iris, just deep black that reflected impossible depths. They were singing, or something like singing, a harmony that made my bones resonate. One of them turned to look at me. It was Miguel from the day shift. His mouth opened, and instead of words, a small fish swam out. Then another. Silverfish that shouldn't exist, swimming through air as if it were water. I ran. The drill floor doors were sealed, the emergency locks engaged. But the control panel had grown what looked like neurons, branching across the wall in patterns that sparked with thought. When I touched the keypad, I felt it trying to read me, to understand what I was. The inhibitor held, but I could feel it weakening. The silver in my veins was turning gray. 10 minutes. The lock disengaged with a sound like a dying breath. The doors opened, and I saw the truth. The drill string hadn't just been contaminated, it had become something else entirely. A massive column of the black substance rose from the well bore, reaching up through the derrick and into the sky. But it wasn't just going up, it was going down too, deeper than our drill had ever reached, connecting to something vast and ancient below. At its base, the organism had formed something almost like a face. Not human, but aware, watching, waiting. I ran to the control console. The manual override was under a locked panel, 3 keys required simultaneously, a safety measure to prevent exactly what I was about to do. But the metal had become soft, organic. I drove my fist through it, feeling bones break, but the pain was distant, unimportant. The switches were still there, still functional. I began the sequence: pressure reverse, safety disengage, emergency implosion protocol. The column of black substance shuddered. The face thing turned toward me, and for a moment, even through the inhibitor, I felt its attention. It was old, older than the Earth. It had traveled between stars and the spaces between spaces, and it had been trapped here when the planet was still molten, caught in cooling rock like an insect in amber. It had been trying to escape for 4 billion years, and we had almost freed it. My hands moved across the console, entering codes I'd memorized years ago, never thinking I'd use them. The rig's entire system began to shift, reversing flows, building pressure in the wrong direction. The organism understood what I was doing. The black substance surged toward me, but I was already moving, climbing up to the emergency trigger, a manual lever that would complete the circuit, start the implosion. The derrick shook, metal screamed. The column of darkness writhed like a living thing, which I supposed it was. 2 minutes. The lever was just ahead, but as I reached for it, I felt the inhibitor fail. The silver in my veins turned black, and suddenly I was connected to it, the vast alien consciousness that had been sleeping beneath the gulf. I saw what it saw. The universe not as we know it, but as a dream dreamed by sleeping gods. Reality was thin, fragile, held together by nothing more than consensus and habit. And there were things outside, pressing against the boundaries, waiting for cracks to appear. This organism wasn't an invader. It was a refugee, fleeing something worse. And we had nearly let it in. 1 minute. I pulled the lever. The implosion started at the bottom, 20,000 feet down, a massive pressure wave traveling up the drill string at the speed of sound. The organism tried to retreat, to flow back down into its prison, but it was too late. The black column collapsed. The face thing opened what might have been a mouth and screamed, a sound that shattered every piece of glass on the rig, that made my ears bleed, that would haunt my dreams forever. Then, silence. The black substance began to retreat, pulling back from the walls, the floors, the air itself. Like a video playing in reverse, it flowed back into the wellbore. The crew members who'd been infected collapsed, some breathing, some not. 0 minutes. But I was still connected. Even as the organism retreated, I could feel its thoughts, its memories, its desperate hope that someone, somewhere, would remember, would know that it had existed, that it had tried. In the last moment before the well sealed, it showed me something, a star map, but not of our sky. Coordinates to places that wouldn't exist for billions of years, a message for whoever might come after. Then the drill floor exploded. I woke up in a helicopter 3 days later. Tommy was there, along with Dr. Warner and 4 others. That was all who'd survived. The official story was a catastrophic equipment failure. The rig was destroyed in a controlled demolition to prevent environmental damage. The company paid out massive settlements with ironclad NDAs. But I kept the recordings. Audio from my suit, video from Tommy's phone. Proof that something else exists beneath the mundane reality we take for granted. Dr. Warner tried to convince me to delete them. She said the world wasn't ready, that panic would serve no purpose. Maybe she was right, but late at night when I can't sleep, I think about that star map. About the message the organism left behind, and I wonder, what was it running from? What could be so terrible that a being older than our world would flee across the cosmos to escape it? Sometimes, in that space between sleep and waking, I hear its voice. Not words, but concepts pressed directly into my mind. It's still down there, sealed but not dead, sleeping again, dreaming its alien dreams. And sometimes I dream them too. The coordinates it showed me, I had Danny check them before he disappeared. They point to a place in the Gulf where the seafloor is especially thin, where the boundary between our reality and whatever lies beneath is weakest. There are 17 other deep water rigs operating in that area, 17 other chances for it to escape, or for something else to get in. Sweet dreams, folks. And remember, next time you turn on a gas stove or fill up your car, think about where that fuel really comes from. Think about what else might be sleeping down there in the dark, waiting for another drill to go just a little too deep. Waiting for another crew to pump something else. Recording begins. This is Jake Morrison, employee ID 447829, Blackwater Energy. The date is October 20th, 2023. If you're hearing this, then they didn't find all the copies. What you just heard, it's all true, every word. But there's one thing I didn't mention. One detail I couldn't bring myself to include. The organism, before the implosion, it showed me something else. Other rigs, other breaches. It's not the only one down there. There are dozens, maybe hundreds, all sleeping, all waiting. And Blackwater knows. They've known for decades. Sound of papers rustling. I have the documents. Rig 15 in 93, Rig 28 in 2001, Rig 39 in 2017, all covered up, all sealed. But the seals don't last forever. They're breaking down. And when they fail, check your water. If it starts to smell wrong, like metal and sulfur and something else, something alive, don't drink it. Pack up, move inland, as far as you can go, because they're waking up. All of them. And this time, we might not be able to put them back to sleep. Recording ends. Did you make it to the end? Still think this is just a story? Check the Gulf of Mexico drilling permits for October 2023. Look for Rate 47. You won't find it. But you will find a 200 square mile exclusion zone that appeared overnight. Listed as environmental protection area. No reason given. No drilling allowed, ever. Makes you wonder what else they're not telling us, doesn't it? Subscribe if you want to hear more. I've got recordings from the other rigs too. But honestly, you might sleep better not knowing. Some things are meant to stay buried, even if we keep drilling deeper. Story number 2. The tour guide's voice stopped mid-sentence when she saw what I was holding. Her face went pale, and for the first time in probably 20 years of giving ghost tours through St. Augustine's narrow streets, Margaret Chen was speechless. The small piece of coquina stone in my palm shouldn't have meant anything, just another fragment from the old city walls. Except for the symbol carved into it, a symbol that, according to every historical record, shouldn't exist in North America. "Where?" she whispered, then louder. "Where did you find this?" That's when I knew. I'd stumbled onto something the oldest city in America had kept hidden for over 400 years. But wait. Let me tell you what really happened, because if you're listening to this late at night, cozy in your bed, you deserve the whole truth. And maybe, just maybe, one of you knows what I should do next. The story begins now. My name's Jake Morrison, and 3 weeks ago I was just another freelance journalist scraping by in Jacksonville, writing fluff pieces about local restaurants and weekend festivals. The email from Heritage America magazine changed everything. They wanted someone to write about St. Augustine's lesser-known history, the stuff beyond the tourist traps and ghost tours. $3,000 for a week's work, I couldn't say no. I drove down on a Sunday morning in early October. The perfect time, really. The summer tourists had gone home, but the weather was still warm enough to walk around comfortably. St. Augustine always felt different from the rest of Florida to me, while Miami and Orlando raced toward the future with their glass towers and theme parks. This place held on to the past with both hands, the narrow streets barely wide enough for cars, the coquina stone buildings that had stood for centuries, the Spanish moss hanging from ancient oaks like nature's own Halloween decorations. It all felt like stepping into another time. I'd booked a room at the Casa Monica, figuring if I was writing about history, I might as well stay somewhere historic. The hotel used to be the Cordova back in the 1880s, built during the Gilded Age when oil tycoons and railroad barons wintered here. My room on the 3rd floor overlooked the Leitner Museum, another Gilded Age relic that used to be an indoor swimming pool for the ultra-wealthy. That first night, I couldn't sleep, not from fear, not yet, but from excitement. I sat at the window, laptop open, making notes while the city settled into darkness below. The street lamps, designed to look like old gas lights, cast these long shadows that made everything look slightly off, like the modern world was just a thin layer painted over something much older. I'd already lined up interviews with local historians, arranged access to the Cathedral Basilica's archives, and even gotten permission to explore some of the sealed sections of the Castillo de San Marcos, the old fort that guards the harbor. But it was a name I'd found in my research that really intrigued me, Dr. Elena Varga, former head of archaeology at Flagler College, who'd abruptly retired 5 years ago after 30 years of teaching. The thing is, nobody retires from Flagler College. It's too prestigious, too comfortable. The campus is literally Henry Flagler's old hotel, one of the most beautiful buildings in Florida. Teachers there usually stay until they're carried out, but Dr. Varga had left suddenly mid-semester with no explanation. I'd found her address through some creative Googling. She lived in a small house on Marine Street, just a few blocks from the fort. When I knocked on her door that Monday morning, coffee and notebook in hand, I expected either no answer or a polite refusal. Instead, she opened the door, took one look at my press credentials, and said, "I've been waiting for someone like you for 5 years." Her house smelled like old books and Cuban coffee. Every surface was covered with artifacts, pottery shards, Spanish coins, Native American arrowheads, but it was the maps that caught my attention. Dozens of them covering the walls, marked with red pins and connected by yarn like something out of a conspiracy thriller. "Mr. Morrison," she said, pouring me the strongest coffee I'd ever tasted, "what do you know about the founding of St. Augustine?" "The basics," I replied. Pedro Menendez de Aviles, 1565, oldest continuously inhabited European settlement in what would become the United States. She laughed, but there was no humor in it. "That's what they teach, yes, but Pedro Menendez didn't discover this place. He was sent here, specifically here, to find something that had been lost." She walked to one of her maps, this one showing the Florida coastline as it might have looked in the 16th century. The Spanish archives in Seville have documents, letters between King Philip Zoo and Menendez. Most are about establishing a foothold in La Florida, protecting the treasure fleets from pirates, converting the natives. But there's one letter, dated just before Menendez departed Spain, that mentions something else. She pulled out a photocopy, the Spanish text barely legible. It talks about La Ciudad Primera, the first city. Not the first Spanish city, the first city, period. Here, before Columbus, before the Vikings even, something ancient that the indigenous Timucua people had been protecting for generations. I wanted to laugh it off as another Atlantis theory, but something in her eyes stopped me. This wasn't some internet conspiracy theorist. This was a woman who'd dedicated her life to archaeology, who'd taught at one of the best colleges in the South. And she'd given it all up because of this. "What kind of city?" I asked. "That's what I spent 15 years trying to find out," she said. "And 5 years ago I finally found something in the last place anyone would look." Dr. Varga led me to her garage, converted into a makeshift laboratory. Tables covered with fragments of stone and pottery, microscopes, chemical testing equipment. It looked like a crime scene investigation unit, but for archaeology. The Castillo de San Marcos, she began, pulling on latex gloves, was built between 1672 and 1695. The Spanish used coquina stone, compressed shells and sand that's unique to this area. But during renovations in 2018, they found something odd. Some of the stones in the deepest foundation weren't coquina. They were limestone. Much, much older limestone. She opened a locked cabinet and pulled out a metal box. Inside, wrapped in acid-free tissue paper, was a piece of stone about the size of my palm. Carved into it was a symbol I'd never seen before, a spiral that seemed to twist inward forever, surrounded by smaller marks that looked almost like a form of writing. This was embedded in one of those limestone blocks, she said. Carbon dating puts it at approximately 3,000 years old, but here's the thing. The Timucua people have only been in this area for about 2,000 years, so who carved this? I reached out to touch it, and she didn't stop me. The moment my fingers made contact with the stone, I felt something. Not supernatural, exactly, but like a vibration just below the range of human perception. Like standing next to a massive subwoofer that's playing a note too low to hear. You feel it too, she said. It wasn't a question. What is it? I don't know. But I found 12 more pieces like this, all embedded in different parts of the city's oldest structures. The cathedral, the old city gates, even in the foundation of the oldest house museum. Someone, a long time ago, placed these throughout St. Augustine. Like markers or warnings. She showed me her map again. Now I understood what the red pins meant. Each one marked where she'd found one of these stones. Together, they formed a rough circle around the old city center with one spot conspicuously empty, the area right around the Fountain of Youth Archaeological Park. You think there's something at the Fountain of Youth? I asked. That tourist trap? No, but underneath it maybe. The whole area is built on shell middens, ancient garbage dumps from indigenous peoples, layers and layers of history, but the owner won't let anyone dig, says it would disrupt the tourist experience. She leaned in closer. Mr. Morrison, I tried to go through proper channels. Applied for grants, petitioned the State Archaeological Board, but every time I got close, something would happen. Funding would disappear. Permissions would be revoked. The college strongly suggested I retire when I wouldn't let it go. Someone doesn't want this found. That should have been my first warning. Should have sent me running back to Jacksonville to write my fluff piece about haunted hotels and pirate museums. But I was hooked. A real mystery, a real story that could make my career. What do you need from me? I asked. Access, she said simply. You're a journalist. You can go places, ask questions that I can't anymore. They're watching me, but they don't know about you. Yet, she gave me a list of places to investigate, people to talk to. But she also gave me something else, one of the carved stones. Keep this with you, she said. I know how it sounds, but I think they're protection. The Timucua knew something we've forgotten. These stones were meant to keep something contained. I should have asked, contained from what? But I was already imagining the article, the book deal, the documentary rights. Pride comes before the fall, as my grandmother used to say, and I was about to fall very, very far. That night, back at the Casa Monica, I couldn't concentrate. The stone sat on my nightstand, and I swear I could feel it, humming, like it was alive somehow. I'd turned off the lights around 11, but sleep wouldn't come. The shadows from the street lamps played across my ceiling, and more than once I could have sworn they were moving independently of the trees outside. Around 2 in the morning, I gave up and decided to take a walk. St. Augustine at night is a different creature than during the day. The tourists are gone, the shops are closed, and the only sounds are the occasional car and the ever-present whisper of the ocean just beyond the city limits. I found myself walking toward the Castillo de San Marcos. The fort is closed at night, of course, but you can walk around its perimeter. The massive walls, 30 feet high and 12 feet thick, have stood against pirates, hurricanes, and armies for over 300 years. In the moonlight, the coquina stone seemed to glow with its own pale light. That's when I saw him. A security guard, but not one of the usual Park Service uniforms. This man was dressed in black, standing perfectly still in the shadow of the fort's entrance. He was watching me, not suspicious watching, like a guard checking on a potential trespasser, but waiting. Like he'd expected me, I nodded, trying to act casual, and continued my walk. But when I glanced back, he was following, not obviously, staying a block behind, but definitely following. I quickened my pace, turned down King Street, then doubled back through an alley. When I emerged onto St. George Street, he was gone, but the feeling of being watched, that didn't go away. The next morning, I tried to convince myself the guard had just been doing his job. Paranoia was Dr. Vargas' thing, not mine. I had work to do. My first official interview was with Margaret Chen, the tour guide I mentioned at the beginning. She'd been doing ghost tours for 20 years and knew every legend, every story about St. Augustine. We met at the Talamado Cemetery, one of the oldest in the city. People think the ghost stories are just for tourists, she said as we walked among the weathered headstones, but they're based on something real. Every culture that's lived here, The Timucua, the Spanish, the British, even the Americans, they all have stories about this place being special. Different. Different how? I asked, my hand unconsciously moving to the stone in my pocket. They say the veil between worlds is thinner here. That's why we have so many ghost sightings, so many unexplained phenomena. But the really interesting thing is that the indigenous peoples seem to understand this. They had rituals, protections. She stopped at a particularly old grave, the inscription worn away by centuries of weather. There's a story that Timucua used to tell, passed down through the few descendants who survived the colonization. They said that long before their ancestors arrived, something else lived here. Something that came from, she pointed down, below. They called it the first darkness in rough translation. The Timucua's entire culture was built around keeping it contained. Contained how? Ceremonies, offerings, and stones. Special stones placed at specific points to create a kind of spiritual fence. When the Spanish arrived and started building their city, they unknowingly disrupted this network. That's when the troubles began. What kind of troubles? Margaret looked around nervously, even though we were alone in the cemetery. Disappearances, people would vanish from locked rooms. Ships would arrive in the harbor with no crew. And the dreams. Everyone who lived here long enough started having the same dreams, of a city beneath the city, older than memory, where things that weren't quite human walked streets that weren't quite real. She must have seen my expression change, because she grabbed my arm. You've had the dreams too, haven't you? I had, the night before, between my restless attempts at sleep. Visions of dark stone corridors, lit by a phosphorescent glow that came from nowhere and everywhere at once. The sound of breathing that wasn't breathing. And always, always, the sensation of something vast and patient, waiting just below the surface of the world. "Show me what you found," Margaret said suddenly. I don't know why I trusted her, but I pulled out the stone. The moment she saw the carved symbol, her face went white. "Where did you get this?" she demanded. "I found it," I lied, not wanting to involve Dr. Varga. "You need to put it back, now. These aren't meant to be moved. They're anchors. Without them..." She was interrupted by a sound I'll never forget. A low rumble, like thunder, but coming from below us. The ground beneath the cemetery rippled, just slightly, like the surface of water when something large moves underneath. Margaret stepped back, her eyes wide with genuine fear. "It's already starting. You've disrupted the pattern. Put it back, Mr. Morrison. Put it back before." She never finished the sentence. A man in a dark suit appeared at the cemetery entrance, and Margaret immediately went silent. He walked toward us with the measured pace of someone who knew they were in complete control of the situation. "Miss Chen," he said with a slight southern accent, "I believe your tour group is waiting for you at the oldest wooden schoolhouse." Margaret looked at me, then at him, then back at me. I saw her mouth the word "run" before she hurried away, leaving me alone with the stranger. "Mr. Morrison," he said, and I noted he knew my name without being introduced. "I represent certain interests that have a stake in preserving St. Augustine's historical integrity. We understand you've been asking questions about matters that are best left undisturbed." "I'm a journalist," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Asking questions is my job." "Indeed, but some questions, Mr. Morrison, lead to answers that nobody wants to hear. St. Augustine thrives on its mysteries, its legends. Solve them, and you destroy what makes this city special. Surely you understand that." There was a threat buried in his reasonable tone, but also something else, fear. This man, whoever he was afraid of something. "What's under the Fountain of Youth?" I asked directly. His composure cracked just for a second. "Nothing that concerns you or anyone else. Mr. Morrison, I'm going to give you one chance. Leave St. Augustine today. Go back to Jacksonville, write your article about our charming ghost tours and historical landmarks, and forget what you think you've learned. This is not a threat, it's a kindness. There are things in this world that should remain buried." He handed me a business card. It was completely blank except for a phone number. "Call this when you've made the right decision," he said, then walked away, leaving me standing among the graves with my heart pounding and the stone burning hot in my pocket. I should have listened. God help me, I should have listened. But that night, I did the opposite. I gathered my equipment, camera, flashlight, crowbar, and headed to the Fountain of Youth Archaeological Park. If they didn't want me to look there, that's exactly where I needed to be. The park closed at 6, but I'd noticed during my earlier scouting that the fence around the back was more suggestion than barrier. By midnight, I was inside, walking among the recreated Timucua village and the spring that Ponce de Leon supposedly thought was the Fountain of Youth. The stone in my pocket was almost unbearably hot now, and it seemed to pulse with that strange vibration. I followed its heat like a divining rod, letting it lead me away from the tourist paths and toward the dense woodlands at the back of the property. That's where I found it. hidden beneath Spanish moss and centuries of vegetation. A stone structure, clearly man-made but older than anything else I'd seen in the city. The entrance was sealed with a massive slab of limestone, but erosion and root systems had created a gap just large enough for a person to squeeze through. I should have called Dr. Varga, should have called anyone, but the stone was burning so hot now I had to wrap it in my jacket, and something was calling to me from beyond that ancient doorway. I squeezed through the gap, my flashlight beam cutting through darkness that seemed almost solid. The passage beyond sloped downward at a steep angle, the walls carved with the same spiral symbol as my stone. But these spirals seemed to move in my peripheral vision, twisting and writhing like living things. The deeper I went, the more wrong everything felt. The air was thick, almost syrupy, and breathing became an effort. My flashlight began to flicker, even though I'd just put in fresh batteries. And the sound. There was a sound coming from below, rhythmic and organic, like the heartbeat of something impossibly vast. The passage opened into a chamber that shouldn't exist. My flashlight beam couldn't find the ceiling or the far walls. Just empty space that seemed to swallow light. But the floor was covered in carvings, thousands of spiral symbols interconnected in a pattern that hurt to look at directly. In the center of the chamber was a pool of water, perfectly circular, perfectly black. It didn't reflect my flashlight beam. It absorbed it, like a hole cut in reality itself. And around the pool were stones, 12 of them, just like the one in my pocket, arranged in a precise circle, but one spot was empty. The moment I noticed this, the stone in my pocket flared with heat so intense I dropped it. It hit the floor and began rolling, not following the slope of the ground, but moving with purpose toward that empty spot in the circle. That's when I understood what Dr. Varga hadn't. These stones weren't just markers or warnings. They were a lock, and I was about to open it. I lunged for the stone, but it was too late. It clicked into place with a sound like breaking bones, and immediately the black water began to move, not rippling, rising, forming shapes that shouldn't be possible with liquid. What emerged from that pool, I can't fully describe it. My mind wouldn't let me process it completely, showing me only fragments. Coils of something that might have been flesh or might have been shadow, eyes that weren't eyes opening along surfaces that weren't faces. The sense of vast intelligence, older than human civilization, regarding me with the same interest we might show to bacteria under a microscope. But worse than its appearance was what it did to my mind. Suddenly I could see the truth, all of it. St. Augustine wasn't built on top of something ancient. St. Augustine was the ancient thing, disguised beneath layers of Spanish architecture and American tourism. Every building, every street, every structure was part of a massive organism that had been sleeping for millennia. The Timucua hadn't been protecting us from it. They'd been feeding it, keeping it docile with rituals and sacrifices. When the Spanish disrupted those rituals, it began to wake. The colonists, without understanding what they were doing, managed to partially reseal it using the stones, incorporating them into their buildings. But the seal was imperfect, incomplete. That's why St. Augustine had so many unexplained phenomena. It was the city itself, breathing in its sleep, occasionally opening one eye to observe the parasites living on its skin. The thing from the pool, it wasn't the threat. It was the city's immune system, finally activated after centuries of suppression. I ran. Turned and ran like I've never run before, up through that passage as the walls began to pulse and contract like a throat swallowing. Behind me, I could hear sounds of pursuit, wet, organic sounds that suggested too many limbs moving in ways that violated physics. I burst out of the entrance just as the first pale light of dawn was touching the sky. The thing didn't follow, couldn't follow, maybe, in daylight. But as I looked back, I saw the vegetation around the entrance growing at visible speed, sealing it off, hiding it again. My car was where I'd left it outside the fence. I drove straight back to the hotel, threw everything in my bag, and was on I-95 heading north within an hour. But at the city limits, my engine died. Just stopped, along with every electronic device I had. My phone, my laptop, even my digital watch. All dead. That's when he appeared again, the man in the dark suit, standing by the road like he'd been waiting. "The city doesn't want to let you go, Mr. Morrison," he said calmly. "You've seen too much. You're part of it now, whether you like it or not." "What are you?" I asked. "We're the keepers," he replied. "For 400 years, my organization has maintained the balance, feeding the city just enough to keep it sleeping. A few tourists who won't be missed. The occasional drifter. It's a small price to pay to keep something that old and powerful from fully waking." He handed me a different business card, this one with an address. "You have two choices. Join us, help us maintain the secret, and live a comfortable life in one of the most beautiful cities in America. Or, well, the city is hungry, Mr. Morrison. It's always hungry." I took the card. That was 2 weeks ago. I'm still in St. Augustine in a nice apartment on Avil Street. Officially, I'm working on a book about the city's colonial history. Unofficially, I help them. I identify tourists who travel alone, who won't be missed immediately. I plant evidence that they simply decided to extend their vacation indefinitely, and sometimes, late at night, I stand guard at certain locations, making sure nobody else stumbles onto what I found. The dreams are getting worse, or better, depending on how you look at it. I can feel the city thinking sometimes, vast thoughts that span centuries. It knows I'm here, it knows all of us are here, and it's patient. So very patient. Dr. Varga was wrong about one thing. The stones aren't protection. They're not keeping something contained. They're keeping something asleep. And every year, as more tourists come, as more construction disturbs the old foundations, as more people forget the old ways of appeasing it, it stirs a little more. The man in the suit, his name is Thompson, by the way, tells me it's been getting harder to maintain the balance. The city is hungrier than it used to be. The disappearances are getting harder to explain. And sometimes, just sometimes, pieces of the real St. Augustine, the ancient, living city, push through the facade. That's why I'm telling you this story, not as a warning to stay away. God knows the city needs tourists, needs food. But because I need you to understand, when you visit St. Augustine, and you will, because something about this story will call to you just like the city called to me, when you visit, pay attention to the rules. Don't wander alone after midnight. Don't investigate strange sounds coming from below the streets. Don't pick up odd stones with strange carvings. And whatever you do, if you see a section of wall that seems to breathe, if you notice that the shadows move wrong, if you feel like the city itself is watching you, don't look closer. Just walk away. Because the oldest city in America has the oldest secret, and it's so much worse than ghosts or pirates or colonial mysteries. It's the secret that St. Augustine isn't built on history. St. Augustine I is history. All of it. Every conquered civilization, every forgotten people, every erased culture. They're all here, digested and incorporated into something vast and alien and eternally patient, waiting for the day when the last stone falls out of place, when the final seal breaks, and the city can finally reveal its true form. Thompson tells me that day might be soon. The development, the tourism, the constant construction, it's all disturbing things that should stay buried. He says they have a plan, something drastic, to reinforce the seal, but it requires sacrifices, big ones. That's why I need one of you, just one, to come to St. Augustine, to come looking for the truth, to come alone, eager and curious, ready to dig into mysteries that shouldn't be disturbed. The city is so very hungry, and I've learned that it's better to feed it volunteers than to let it choose its own meals, so please. If this story kept you up, if you're lying in bed right now wondering if any of it could be true, if you're already planning a trip to St. Augustine to investigate for yourself, please come. Ask for Jake Morrison at the Columbia Restaurant on St. George Street. I'll be waiting. I'll always be waiting, because that's what the city wants. And what the city wants, the city gets. After all, it's been getting what it wants for 3,000 years, and we're all just temporary residents in its endless dreaming body. Sweet dreams, if you can still have them after hearing this. And remember, when you feel that pull to visit St. Augustine, that irresistible urge to see for yourself if any of this is real, that's not curiosity. That's the city calling you home.